Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Releasing Your Inner Dragon with Drake and Marie. I am one of your hosts, Maxwell Alexander Drake. I'm an award-winning novelist, former lead fiction writer for Sony's EverQuest Next, invited to teach creative writing all over the world. As always, with me is my other host, Marie.
Hi, my name is Marie Mullaney. I am a YouTuber with a fantasy world-building channel, and I write epic fantasy.
And today we're going to get back to our talk on punctuation, where we had started in part one, and then we had the 100th episode that we kind of rambled on waxing all philosophical about the journey. But now we're going to get back to work and go into finishing up the punctuation. We have several different topics that we're going to go through that we didn't cover in the first part of this. But as always, before we do, please help us out, help us defeat the evil algorithm monster. Like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, all of that. Also, I want to take just a second to kind of push something that I'm doing. So you're listening to this, hopefully because you're a writer, and hopefully because you're trying to become a better writer. Well, I have launched a new platform where you can actually work with me closely on a weekly basis. And actually, Maria's maybe get roped into this as well. We're still trying to figure that out. But if you want to work with us, or at least me, on a weekly basis to improve your writing, and we're talking about you being there, and you're also with a group of motivated people who are also trying to do the exact same thing, then I highly recommend that you check out the Writer's Room. And the web address is writersroom.us. It'll be down in the links. But for listeners of this podcast, I'm offering a 50% off membership for as long as you want to be a member. It's normally $100 a month. So if you do want to get 50% off for life, basically, I'm not going to post that link because it's not a link that I want out there. So either send me an email to author@maxadrake.com, hit me up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or X, I guess I should say, and LinkedIn, or just hit starvingwriterstudio.com and do the contact me form. However you want to reach me, tell me that you want to join the Writer's Room for 50% off, and I will send you your own personal link that you'll be able to sign up to and get that membership for 50% off for life. But you do have to reach out to me because I am not going to post that link anywhere. So if you want to improve your writing, I guarantee you, I have made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of better writers. I was all blushing when we did last week's podcast because Marie talked about how much I've impacted her writing. So if you would like to also have me help you to become a better writer, work with me on a weekly basis, plus get access to everything that I'm doing and all of my words of wisdom and everything else, please think about joining the Writer's Room. All right. So let's get into this. What are some of the top? Well, I mean, you have the list of the things. So what do we miss, and what are we going to go into today?
So one of the things we were specifically asked to talk about is dialogue punctuation. And the other thing that we haven't yet talked about in the punctuation topic is scenes and chapters and chapter headings and when you should scene break and so on. You're more kind of like, when is it, we spoke about paragraph breaks, but when do you scene break, when do you chapter break, etc. And I guess I would like to talk first about chapter breaks, because I am on and off kind of toying with a little urban fantasy story at the moment. And I'd gotten to the point where the main character wakes up and learns that somebody has died, somebody that they're close to has died. And I ended up writing a 700-word chapter. There's only 700 words in the chapter because she learns that the person's died and goes into a state of grief. And I was like, anything that follows on from this point in this chapter is going to feel as flat as a pancake and entirely irrelevant. I've just dropped a big hammer. Like, you don't drop a hammer and then follow it up with butterflies and plot and plans and whatever. You let the hammer be a hammer.
So this is less
Yeah.
So this is less about punctuation and more about scene setting, but yes, you know, I agree with you. I mean, I haven't read that chapter obviously, but I 100% agree with you once you drop a bombshell like that. I think I think one of the things that I see the most that I think people mess up on when they're trying to figure out where to end that scene is the recap. When I'm teaching scene construction, I don't have, the fifth thing isn't recap, but I see so many people end a chapter by basically giving everything that happened in the chapter in kind of this recap mode, and they're like, that's how I end it. So I mean, there's different ways to do this. My writing style is very, very, very slice of life, and I know this. So I take a moment in time and I give you that moment in time. And then how I build my stories is, what are the moments in time that can build off of each other and be strung together and create a story? And I skip whatever needs to be skipped. I skip all the, I mean, you'll never have somebody use the bathroom in my stories, or take a shower in my stories, or sleep in my stories, or eat, unless, something is happening in those scenes that the eating a meal is there as window dressing for the scene or whatever. But I'm never going to give you the just all the different mundane things in between stuff. It's just this moment.
So I just on that mundane moment things, yes and no. So yes, I don't linger on the mundane, but I do. For example, if somebody wakes up from like 14 hours in a bed or whatever, for the sake of realism, I will have them go find a bathroom or talk about wanting a bathroom or whatever, because I like, human beings exist in like these are things that exist. So to some extent, but also like it very much depends, because for example, you can take a shower, or you can stand in the shower with your head against the glass, like in agony over something that has just gone wrong, and you're just sitting there with the steam curling around you while the water's hitting you, and you're just like, what do I do now?
Right.
There's
But
taking showers, and there's taking
that's what I'm
showers.
but that's what that goes back to. The shower is not the scene.
Yes.
The remorse, the regret,
Mm,
the uncertainty, the mental anguish, that's the scene, and you're just
mm.
setting it in a shower.
Yeah.
So, it's funny. The bathroom, I think, is the funniest thing, or the need for humans to relieve themselves.
Mm.
You are correct, and I see so many people do it, and there's nothing wrong with it. Where, well, my character's waking up, everyone who wakes up has got to use the bathroom. That is just the way it is.
Mm.
I've never done that. Like in Genesis, when there's two scenes back to back where the characters wake up, and neither one of them even mentions the
Mm.
urge, the need, the desire, the whatever, and no one notices. So, like,
I don't
the
I
reason
don't
why I
do
do
it
it, though,
every time, but I do it. For
no,
example, there was one where Louis was tied to a bed for I think 18 hours, and after he got untied, man, did he need the bathroom. But that to
right,
me was just like an emphasis of like the amount of time.
right, exactly. In the original version of the Genesis book one. Now I changed this. This is one of the things that I did change. But in the original version, one of the characters hides in a wagon for 3 days and doesn't want to be seen. So when you do something like that, I did have to explain how he relieved himself without getting caught.
Yeah.
Um, that's all gone now, so I don't even have to do that. I'm just saying that. So to finish that up, when there's going to be a question of, wait a minute now, how, like, everybody does have this. I think that is important. What I have discovered and what I've decided in my writing is the normal stuff. I just never mention it. So I've never had a character wake up and then have to relieve himself, unless the relieving is going to cause, something like, he gets his penis bit by a snake when he's out in the woods. But then that's it, the scene isn't about, oh yeah, I need to be realistic and have him use the bathroom. It's, this is going to happen. Because I did write for that video game that I was working on, that's on hold right now. there is a scene where the main hero comes up on some bandits or whatever, and she waits for one of them to take a leak. And it's actually one of my favorite lines because they call him Redbeard, and because he's got this big red beard. And so he goes over and he's using the bathroom, and she's like, "This is my chance. I can take him out, and then I'll take the other two out." And I think the line is something like, "He turned around his little red beard on full display." And I just thought that was hilarious. But again, it's not him using the bathroom, it's him separating and all of that. And that's been done in movies millions and millions of times.
That's
But
like, but normal actions should only really enter the equation when they are either emphasizing abnormal things or they're part of the plot in some way.
when that's my point. A lot of people do it because they're like exactly what you said. And there's nothing wrong with it. Like, this is not a bad thing. They go, well, for realism, I'm going to have my character do this. And I agree with that. It's just that I've went the opposite direction and never been called on it. No one has ever gone, wait a minute. Ardari wakes up, he washes his face, and then he just goes down to breakfast. And then he leaves breakfast and goes straight to work. Like, he never, ever does anything. Like, because I mean, it's mapped out. Like, he's in the bedroom, he slaps his cousin, he literally runs downstairs, and then it says he goes straight into the kitchen, he talks in there, and then he goes straight to the table and eats, and then he, the next is he's running out the door with food in his mouth. Like there's literally not even a time where you could legitimately say that he went and used the bathroom. And yet nobody even questions it. So I'm just saying you don't have to do it, is my point. There's nothing wrong with doing it.
No, there's nothing wrong with doing it, but you don't have to. And I don't think that it should be an everyday thing, because I think that's just going to clog your, if you do it every time the character wakes up, man, is it going to clog up the book. You know what I mean? Like, that's a lot of word count for something that's not important. But that being said, I want to get back to chapter breaks and scene breaks. So if you hit an emotional high in a chapter, do not think that you can follow it up with a low. Like, you understand what I'm saying? Like this, I had this grief moment, which is an emotional, impactful moment. You can't then go from there into like, okay, and now I'm going to plan how I'm going to plot my next move. Because the reader has just been given this enormous grief, impactful thing. To then expect them to go from there straight into the plot again.
So I agree 100% with what you're saying, and yet I'm going to push back on that.
Okay.
Literally. So like in the scene that you're describing, when you were describing, I was like, oh yeah, she's 100% right. I absolutely would never do that. She's, you've got to, like, you're grieving, like, you're not going to do this thing. However, before this podcast, you just read a chapter that I wrote yesterday that this massively, thing happens and the character is completely distraught, but that's only about a third of the chapter. The chapter continues on because and I think it works because it happens in the middle of her doing a normal daily routine, and the day has to go on. She's there to do the routine. And so just because this thing happens, like, and I think it works, basically, just to enlighten you, she accidentally kills somebody that she shouldn't have killed. It's during a sparring match, but she didn't mean to kill him, but she does. And so the rest of the chapter, other things are happening that move the story, but she's also dealing with this mental baggage of this moment. And so like when you were saying it first, I was like, oh yeah, definitely, you never do that, you never do it. But then I was like, wait a minute, I literally just did this yesterday in a scene. So there are, as with everything, there's no hardcore rules, all rules, but Marie's 100% right for the most part. Like, you're going to hit that scene, and that needs to be, unless you have this, because for me, the chapter that I wrote, the point of that chapter is not the mental burden of accidentally murdering somebody. The point of that chapter is she has to continue on instantly with her day as if it didn't matter that she just murdered somebody, and everybody knows it. It's not even like it's a secret, but it's a real, this is a horrible world, and she accidentally murders a slave, so nobody, as far as the law is concerned, nobody cares. So it's not like there's any ramifications from society. It's just ramifications on her own mental being. And so it just depends. So like there's another scene where a different character, and this is in the next book, accidentally murders somebody that he doesn't mean to, kind of in the same way. It's almost kind of like a parallel to this. And that ends there. Like it ends at that moment, and it cannot continue after that, because it's different. So it really does depend on what you're trying to do and what the scene is and who the characters are and what you're trying to tell in the story and everything else.
I guess that the thing for me that I've taken from what you've just said for our listeners is that it depends on what emotions the reader is going to experience. Because here's the thing, with your chapter, your character experiences these emotions, but it's an emotion of I have to carry on.
Right.
Like that is the drive of it, right? So yes, she experiences remorse for killing this guy and so on, but her battle with those emotions is the point of the chapter.
Right, exactly. So it depends on what you're doing.
Yeah. With my character, she finds out a piece of information and she's sitting in a bed in the hospital. Like the piece of information and its impact on her is the point of the chapter.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, when you were first describing, in my head, I was just like, absolutely 100%. As always, we're on the same side. But then, like 5 minutes ago, I literally read a scene that I wrote yesterday that doesn't do that. So it was funny that it struck me like that.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the point in creative writing is golden rules are golden rules, and you don't break them unless you have this ironclad, perfect, absolute, brilliant reason for doing it that actually works to grow the character and drive the story and impact the reader.
Yeah.
And so like that chapter that I wrote yesterday happens to accidentally fill that bill on this discussion.
Yeah.
But I think it's the only one I've ever written like that in my 30 years of writing. I don't think I've ever written a scene where somebody does something that dramatic, isn't impacted. I mean, because she's obviously impacted hugely. The world isn't. Like the rest of the world is like, whatever. Like you stepped on an ant, who cares? She is crushed by it. But you're right. The scene is not about her being crushed. It's about her having to continue on in this moment. And that's the other thing is, sure, could I end it there? Because when you were saying that, I actually was in my head going, wait a minute, could I end the chapter there? Which is basically where the end of it where you read, because there's another 3,000 words after that. Could I end it there and then pick up later? And I was like, but that's not the point. The point is to have her have to struggle to act like it's normal and to deal with the situation of that scene that is next. Because the accidental death is not even, it's only an opener. It's not a part of the scene. The scene is actually her dealing with her boss.
Yeah.
And her weird relationship with her boss.
But that's the thing, is her that the point of that chapter is her reacting in an abnormal way,
right,
to what the world regards as an insignificant event.
Right.
So the emotional peak of killing the dude is not the emotional peak of the chapter.
100%. So at the end of this, it's that you have to think about, you can't just follow these rules blindly. You have to go, okay. And that's what I always say when I'm critiquing somebody, if they can give me a reason why they did it, whether I agree with that reason or not is beside the point. If they can give me a reason for it. So the same thing, the reason why I read Marie that is because I was looking for feedback. And she gave me some feedback that was brilliant that I never would have thought about because of the reason that I had in my mind for writing this moment. And so I told her the reason, kind of as what you just said actually fixes my problem, but here's why I didn't even see that. Here's what I was trying to do. And she's like, well, you can still accomplish that sort of with it. And I'm like, yeah, you're right, 100%. Because I was locked into the reason that I created, I couldn't see, I knew there was a problem, but I couldn't see the solution for it because I'm locked in to this reason that I've come up with for this scene. And that's why getting that feedback from other people, and it's not just getting feedback. That's the whole point is when you get feedback, you should be actively trying to believe them. Doesn't mean you follow them blindly. That's not what I'm saying. If you follow people blindly, your story will be ruined because you'll have 30 people writing your story for you. Maria's not going to write anything for me, but I am going to actively try to see if she's correct in her critiques and feedback, because I'm looking to solve a problem that I know is there that I can't see a solution for, because I'm too close to it. I've got my biases where I've locked in. No, the reason is this, and so this is what I'm looking at. And so, like, if you keep locking in on your own things, then don't even ask for feedback, because you're an idiot for doing it, because you're never going to listen to anybody anyway. And also, you'll never find these match, because the suggestion you gave me, I'm like, I was supposed to do something after this podcast. I'm literally now going to rewrite it. I can't not rewrite that now, because it's like, I'm so giddy and excited because I do believe it's going to fix the problem that I know is there that I couldn't see. So yeah, it's just, you have to think about this stuff. So anyway, sorry. That's more of a writer growth thing. Let's get back to punctuation.
Yeah, so I mean, all of that is relevant to like chapter thing. And so, and I do here want to talk about scene breaks as well. So scene breaks, okay, you should think when you should absolutely scene break. You should absolutely scene break if you're changing POVs. You like, I can think of almost no exceptions to that rule.
No, there isn't. I can't. It's
Omniscient.
so jarring. It's so jarring to rip the reader out of one person's head and put them into a completely different head. You know, again, we just talked about, there's, you know, every golden rule can be broken, but there are some that I'm sure there's something out there, but it's never been shown to me. I'm 100% in your camp. I cannot think of a single reason that anybody should ever do that, mostly because of how horribly jolting it is for the reader.
The only time when you can effectively head hop, which is what that is, and it means scene break, head hop, you know, head hop completely into somebody else's mind, is if you're writing fully omniscient. And don't do that. Like, because you can. If you're omniscient, you can, because you can, you know, you can
technically, in omniscient, you're supposed to have a focal character for the scene that you only give the insights to that character, and everybody else is considered a secondary, tertiary character.
So to an extent, but I mean, the classic of omniscience, the most omniscience of omniscientness, Mr. Tolkien himself, there are scenes where he absolutely gives you the internal thoughts of a fox who run, and he puts it in italics and stuff. Like, so you know, omniscience got different rules. You could, but I am not, as a standard, I'm going to recommend against writing an omniscient.
In my opinion, omniscient is a dead POV. It's the least immersive. Readers today do not want to not be immersed. You know, you brought up Lord of the Rings. I mean, one of the things, and I've said this before on this podcast, when I'm out on tour and that comes up, I'll be in a room of 500 people, all fantasy geeks, and I'll ask the question, how many people have started Lord of the Rings but never finished it? And half of the audience raises their hand. And I get it's one of the most popular, most best-selling fantasy stories of all times, but I do not want to write a story where half of my readers don't finish it. Like, that is, in today's world, it's suicide. I mean, back then you had Lord of the Rings, and then a decade later you had the Chronicles of Narnia. Like, that's it. Those are your two choices if you're a fantasy fan. You don't have anything else. So that's not the case today. Yeah. You're not going to be successful if half the people never finish your book.
So I mean, yeah. Scene breaks, obviously, when you switch POVs, you scene break. Like, pretty much the end. If you can come up for a reason why you wouldn't scene break and switch POVs, by all means, hit us up in the comments, and we will check it out and see whether it is a legitimate breaking.
And by that, it doesn't mean just doing it. It means that you do it in a way that doesn't negatively impact the reader's flow through the story. If you pop the reader out of the story, you have failed, period. I don't care what your reason is for doing it. If the reader is jolted out of the story, that's not you failed. You've done it incorrectly. So like just to go back to that, just to put a nail in that, the ending a scene after a dramatic break, the way I did it in that chapter does not jolt you out of the story. You have to, just like she does, you have to continue on with today's things. You have no choice. She has no choice. So you're not like, well, wait a minute now. Whereas like with the chapter Marie's discussing, it would feel bad to the reader. You're like, wait a minute, no, I want to grieve for a minute. I actually, it's set up. I'm in bed. I'm alone. Give me time to grieve with this character. I don't want to then just start doing my day. And so again, it's all about the reader. I say this all the time. There's only one thing real, and that's the reader. And so the character in bed in Marie's story is not actually grieving because they're not real. The character in my story is not actually worrying about murdering somebody because both of them are not real. The murder person and them. Like, so it's only about what the reader is experiencing. And, in Marie's, the reader needs to take a breath. They need that. They need that moment. They've consumed this thing. They want to make sure that they want that moment to go, yeah, man, that is horrible for this character. I feel really bad for them, all this. And then in mine, they have to go, man, you can't grieve, can you? That I feel sorry for you because you can't grieve. You're now dealing with this other situation with this weight of what you just did, and you can't even acknowledge it. So, again, it's all about the reader. It has nothing to do with that. So yeah, I switching POVs, there's just no, I'd love to be proven wrong. So yeah, definitely hit us up in the comments, send us an email at releasingyourinnerdragon@gmail.com. Because I don't think you'd be done. So prove us wrong.
Then the other thing that I want to talk about, since we're here at scene breaks and switching them for POVs, is when to decide to include multiple POVs in a single chapter. Because that is in and of itself a decision. So I'll talk about when we decided to do this in Magic 4. We were in the data center. For those of you who've read that far in Magic Fall, or who've read Magic Fall, book 1 of Skies of Destiny, we were in the data center. And in the data center, we had Lyron going off to do his thing, and we had Buri and Mota going off to do another thing. And it did not make sense to switch chapters because everything was kind of flow. It was Lyron doing his stuff over here. Then we had Mota and Buri doing stuff. Then we had Lyron doing stuff. Yeah, it's all basically at the same time. And the only way to not cover the same ground, to not go back in time, was to literally have a scene, a scene, a scene, a scene.
Right.
Because otherwise it would have been like a chapter of Lyron, and then going back in time, this is what's been going on with Buri. And that never works the way you think it is. Okay? Right. In my opinion. Because what happens is the reader goes like, no, but I'm here in this point of the story. Why are you taking me backwards in time? I want to know what goes forward.
Well, also, when you look at a chapter, just like a sentence, just like a paragraph, just like a scene, a chapter is a defined moment of time. And so since these two characters, who are both POV characters, are doing this thing, it's all happening in this moment of time. So it needs to be encapsulated within that confines, just like a sentence is that sliver, and then a paragraph is that moment, and then the scene is the same thing, and then the chapter. So because of that, we're going to need to do it. Now, the old Drakester hasn't always been the most brilliant of people. So my first book, which is the book that's going to come out in the next 4-6 months as a rewrite, one of the things that I had decided back then, I don't even know why I got onto this thing, but I had put it in my head that I will never write a scene break, ever, for any reason. No scene breaks, only chapters. And there is, in the original version, and it's gone, I fixed it because it ain't gonna happen now, but in the original version, there's a scene where two POV characters are fighting for their life against this monster. And it's about 14 chapters, and each chapter is a paragraph or two. Now, reading it, it wasn't an issue. It really wasn't. You know, you go, you read the couple thing, you flip the page, you're now into a new chapter, you're now into a different POV, and it reads actually really well. It would have read just as good with scene breaks, but it does not affect the read in any way, shape, or form. However, what it did affect was Arderi did this and this and this. Chapter 42. Clytus then dodged. Chapter 43. So in the audiobook, they have to read the chapter name. And so every paragraph or two, the narrator would then read chapter 41 and then start with it. So it completely, like when you're flipping pages, you're just flipping them.
I would argue that even if you're flipping pages, that is going to affect you, because you have chapter titles that matter. And in Sangwheel Chronicles, I have in-world flavor text on top of every chapter.
So I didn't. The rewrite has the chapter titles now, but the original one did not have.
Okay.
All they had, that was another thing, is I just had no, I didn't even have that. In the original, I'm pretty sure, pull it out just to make sure. Because I still have, but I'm pretty sure I don't have. Yeah, no. Every one of them is just the chapter, and then it goes right into it. But you know, when we get into here, wherever it's at.
But it's still like, for me, it would definitely be a pause. You know what I mean? Because I have to flip. I'd be like, why can't I just read the whole thing?
Yeah. It was definitely a dumb idea. I'm definitely not denying that. So 45, which is on page 319. Just because it's funny, I'm gonna flip through it to show my stupidity. So chapter 44, flip a page. Chapter 45, flip a page. Chapter 46, flip a page. Chapter 47. Like, it's definitely not one of the things that I am exceedingly proud of in my career. But again, to my mind 20 years ago, where I was at as a writer and what how I saw the writing world and how I saw the craft and everything like that, I was like, oh, this is the right way to do it. This is brilliant. No one else does it, but I'm going to do it because I'm special. And it's, I'm so clever that I'm smarter than everyone else. And it's like, yeah. So, we all made, and now in the rewrite, it's just scene break, scene break, scene break, scene break, screen break, which now you just read through it because now you just have this little dealy bob. However, that causes its own problems with the audiobook, because when you're reading it, you get the visual little dealy bob, the whatever your symbol is that shows the scene break. The audiobook reader doesn't do that. And that's so the reason why I did it was I thought that it was going to be a fix, because they just read in one head and then they just keep reading in the next head. They don't really even pause that much in audio. And so it throws you out a little bit because you're like, wait a minute, I just head hopped, because that's what it feels like in the audio version.
So I think that there you should maybe just have a word with your audiobook narrator, because you can, like, for example, I narrate my own audiobooks, and when I hit a scene break, I leave a 3-second gap.
Right.
It's not a huge gap, but 3 seconds is plenty enough to give the. I mean, nobody's going to pause for 3 seconds in narration, right? It's too long. So in my mind, 3 seconds gives the reader enough time to be like, oh, okay, I'm breaking into.
Because you don't want to do something like new scene, because that's the same thing as going chapter 42, chapter 43. Like, it throws you out of it. So it's weird. It's something to think about when you're dealing, especially with that. I mean, I think there's like 5 or 6. I mean, I think there's like 10 or 12 chapters like that, where each one is just a paragraph or two long. So, because a fight scene, it's an entire fight scene that you're
Yeah.
bouncing back and forth between these two characters.
But yeah.
So
So
I'm still gonna have to figure out what I'm gonna do with that in the audiobook, because I'm still not gonna be satisfied. I'm, definitely have thought about the whole, well, I'll pause a little bit or I'll do this. Really, what I'm doing is, or what I've done, because that's all rewritten, is I just really made sure that the opening line of the new scene had a solid grounding of the POV. So character name and internal emotion, so that you knew in that line. So I can, first one, Pain rated it through our dairy, blah, blah, blah. Then you have that. And then the next scene, Clytus's throat clamped shut as fear raced through him. Like, so I did do that. I made sure that in every one of them, you get the character's name almost instantly and an internal emotion in that first sentence to just drive home to the reader, you are in a new head.
and I do want to just linger on that thought for a moment before we go to dialogue and so on. And that is that it is very, very, very important, if you're writing multi-POV and you're writing limited of any stripe or flavor, that you drop the character's name nice and early so the reader knows whose head they're in. Even if your chapter names are character names, okay, which some people do, like, I mean, Martin famously does.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you do that, I would still say you need to drop the character name, because not everybody reads character title or chapter titles. Heck, there are people who skip the flavor text. And I mean, in my mind, that's part of the chapter, right? No,
Right.
they just skip straight over that italic version.
Yeah.
They like gave me the chapter. So
Yep. Yeah. I know tons of people who skip the flavor text.
yeah.
And it's understandable. Most of the time it doesn't, it meant more to the author than it means to the story. But then you have like Mistborn, where the flavor text is an entire separate novel that is that is literally everything you need to know to understand. You don't realize this until the end, but it literally is its own novel that you kind of need to really understand the actual novel. So he really did a great job with that. He being Brandon Sanderson. But yeah, so that's why almost every single one of my chapters, if it doesn't open with the character's actual name, they're in that first sentence or in that first paragraph at the least, unless there are a couple times where the character doesn't know who they are, and so since the character doesn't really remember who they are or whatever, and there's reasons for that, like there's one chapter that's a magical reason that he doesn't know who he is. There's a lot of he's and hims and all of that, and there's no name at all, because again, I'm always trying to make my reader feel what my character feels, and if my character doesn't know who they are, then I'm just going to omit that information from the reader. So they're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is really weird. Why do I not know whose head I'm in? Because the character doesn't know whose head they're in.
I have one chapter that opens with they pronouns until like the character realizes, oh, wait, I'm actually separate from these other entities, because it's one of those moments. So,
right.
An
orgy of the mind.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, wait, no, wait, I'm separate.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you have reasons, and again, this goes back to exactly what we've been talking about this whole time, you need to know the reason why you're doing what you're doing. It doesn't mean that reason is going to work. Doesn't mean that reason is right. But if you don't have a reason, I guarantee you almost every time you're going to do it wrong, because you're not even thinking about it. You're just going off instinct, and most of your instincts are going to be wrong.
Yeah.
So, you have to understand why you do what you do, so that you have the best chance of being successful with it. But even then, as we just discussed, I had a reason for what I did in that chapter that I just wrote yesterday. And I knew there was something. I mean, that's why I even took it to, I don't normally read it my critique groups that I run. I normally it's for, my students, but I read last night because I know there's something not just, and I can't figure out, I don't see it. And that's the problem, is you're seeing everything from only your side of it. You need to see your writing from other people's perspective. So I also bogarted Marie before we get started. I want to read something like, because I'm struggling, I can't see it. And even after last night, they gave me some things to think about. But again, these are my students. So while they had some great feedback, it didn't fix, I still didn't feel like I had the solution until, and again, I don't know if I have the solution until I actually execute it, but I feel pretty good about um the suggestions that Marie has given me. And so I do kind of see where this is going to fix my problem.
There are different people who offer different like
Yes.
levels of advice. Like I get a lot of really good line editing advice from Critique Circle, but if I really need like plot advice, then I tend to ask specific people. Like I'll ask you, or
Right.
because
Well,
there are some things that you need a certain level of like, I don't know, like ability to put a plot together.
yeah. I mean, it basically works. I think both of us can lift the same amount of weight, but you can't lift red weights and I can't lift blue weights. So, yeah. we each have, I mean, I think both of us are about the same strength as a writer. I don't see a lot of difference between us when you look at us from a whole. But when you look at focused aspects of writing, there's things that you are so much stronger than me on, and there's things that I'm so much stronger than you on. And that's just
Like
normal.
like
You're
you
never
you
great at everything.
definitely don't want to ask me for advice on how to do a more emotional scene.
And you definitely don't want me to do colors or clothing. Like, I'm terrible with both of those. I just don't see, I'm not colorblind. I just don't care. I
Yeah.
mean, if you notice, almost every day I'm in a gray shirt and a gray sweatpants. Like, I just, colors don't mean a lot to me.
Yeah.
I've talked about that before on this show, and same thing with clothing. So, and not that those are my only weaknesses; those are just my funny weaknesses. So yeah, it's you need to see your writing through other people's eyes. You need to get that feedback, and you need to actively try to believe them, not follow them blindly. That's not what we're saying. So anyway,
Yeah.
so going back to the whole scene break. So obviously switching POVs, but
Yes.
there's other reasons.
Yes.
If you're changing locations, a scene break will save you from having to actually write the transportation. You can literally just go, you can end one scene with, and again, it has to be a chapter. So it has to be an encapsulated thing that's all happening. But let's say the first part of it happens in New York, and then the actual event is still happening, but it happens now in Chicago. You can end one scene with, and then they boarded a train to Chicago, and then just scene break. And then in the next scene, you open up with, stepping off the train in Chicago. Like, and now you've done this whole thing. And why is that important? Because again, the only thing that's real is the reader. And by giving them that visual clue and the transition out and the transition in, they are absolutely comfortable that they just skip this entire thing. They know where they're at. They're grounded. They're not lost. And again, it's for them. It's not for you.
And they know that they missed nothing in the train journey. They're
Right.
like, okay, the train journey just passed, like nothing weird happened. It was just a train journey. Everybody's taking a train journey. We move along. Well, maybe
Yep.
not
And
everyone.
then,
I don't know how many people take train journeys, but
right. And
Yeah.
then everything is ditto on moving time.
Yeah.
We move a day in advance, a month in advance, an entire season in advance. Again, you can't do that if the event, because otherwise just do another new chapter. If we end something in this winter and then we pick up at the beginning of next winter, but it's something completely different, we need to make that a new chapter. But if it is, let's say the spouse dies, and this chapter we're in grieving from that, and we're going to grieve for an entire year, and then next winter we're going to start coming out of that grief. Depending on how that's written, maybe that all needs to be in one chapter. So we end the grief, and with whatever transition, the snow starts falling, blah blah blah, or maybe it's just that winter, so it's snow falling in the beginning and then snow melting. So we scene break with the snow falling, we, you know, on the other side of the scene break, the snow is melting, and the audience knows that the time has passed, and we're still doing, like, if the whole, and again, it has to be connected, it can't just be some random thing. So this isn't a great example, but like if the entire scene is about the grief period, then maybe that becomes its own chapter or whatever.
Okay, so that's scenes and chapters. Do you have anything more to say on that before we hit dialogue?
I don't think so. I mean, again, it's just thinking about the fact it's just like a paragraph, it's just like a sentence. Everything. Oh, wait, no, there is something I do want to talk about. Because we talked about multiple POVs where they are doing different things, but all, like in ours, they were both trying to solve the same problem, just in two different locations of this data center. So they both have their tasks, but it's all happening simultaneously. There is another reason. So there is a scene that I wrote where there's two POV characters in it. One is a young 17-year-old, the other is a 40-year-old jaded mercenary. They're going to do this one thing. There's only one thing happening. They're both doing it together. Anytime you have multiple POVs in the same scene, how you decide whose perspective to write from is you just ask yourself who is impacted more by this moment. So, I always use the thing where you're writing a romance and you've got, Drake and Sally, and they're both going to, they both agreed to meet at this cafe, and Drake is meeting because he just spent 3 months' salary buying an engagement ring. And Sally is going there because she met Steve and she's going to tell Drake that it's over. Both are interesting, but which is more dramatic? And while it's going to be weird for Sally to break up with somebody who's on his knees with a wedding ring in his hand, it's going to be crushing to Drake. So I'm absolutely writing that scene from Drake's perspective. So that's it. Just one scene. I'm going to do the whole thing. Yes, I'll get Sally's how she felt about it, but I'll do that in a later chapter.
Unless Sally is going there to break up with Drake, and then he goes down on one knee, and she feels too guilty to break up with him, and she accepts the freaking wedding engagement.
Certainly, absolutely. Then Drake doesn't know, so Drake has no drama. But again, it's still the same thing. All the drama is now on Sally's part. That's a great, I never even thought about it like that. Because I've given this example for 20 years and I never thought about doing it with the flip. But then, if Drake never knows that she's there to break up with him, then absolutely the drama is going to be on Sally, and she's the one that's going to be, totally destroyed inside and confused and, all of this other stuff. And so that's where we want it to be. So 100%. And just like we talked about, when you have multiple PVs doing the same thing, but in two different ways or two different locations or whatever. However, going back to the scene. So I have these two characters walking through a bazaar. They're doing one thing. They're together and they're doing one thing. It's one chapter. But in the first half of the scene, something happens that definitely affects the younger character more than it affected the older character. And it's also a piece of world building that he gets that the older character just doesn't care and wouldn't notice because he already knows. And so if the older character notices it, then I'm just giving information to the reader. Like, the character's not actually getting that information. So by doing it in the younger character, I'm giving him new information, which is really giving the reader new information. Plus, it impacts him more. So the first half of the scene, I write from the kid's perspective. And then I reach a point where it's still one scene. It's still going to do this one thing. But that thing that impacted the younger characters over, I scene break. I slip into the older character's head because the last half of the scene impacts them way more than it impacts the younger kid. And so I'm nothing's happened simultaneously. It's one contiguous scene. But again, since both are POVs, and the rule is when we have multiple POVs in the same scene, we're going to write from the head of the person that it has the most drama. And even though we could have, I could have written all from the kid's perspective and just let the last half of it not be as impactful, or I could have written it from the older guy's perspective and had the first part of it not be as impactful. Don't do that. Like, I can give this as long as it still has those 5 elements of a scene, because a scene has to have a setup, a conflict, a rise to that conflict, an overcome, and then a hook. So there's still a hook. The young character is still like, ooh, I have this unresolved, because you know that's still gonna, now that's going to take place for him later in his story. So I still have the hook. Then in the new scene, and I think the thing that people miss with that is setup. You're in a new scene. Yes, I'm still in the same bazaar, but the older character is going to see this bazaar different than the younger character, where the younger character saw chicks and food and shiny objects. The older character sees, you know, thieves and crooked merchants and, you know, shady deals. And you still have to set the scene, even though it's the same scene, but you do it from that character's perspective. So it almost feels like you're in a different bazaar when you slip into the older character's head, because you're like, wait a minute, this bazaar was like happy-go-lucky a second ago, and now it's dark and dangerous. What happened? It's the same bazaar. It's just how the characters view things and what they're going to notice. So I think that's where a lot of people miss when they switch from scene to scene to scene. You don't miss it so much in like what you were talking about with Magic Fall, because they're actually in different locations, so you actually have to set those up. But you still have to set it up every time you go into a new scene. You have to have that set up, even with what we did in Magic Fall, where we bounced back and forth a couple times in the same scene.
You still have to do it.
Scene.
Yeah, you still have to have at least a sentence of like, you know, there was gray monitors, there was this, there was that, because the reader is now being put in a new character's head, and they have to be reminded about what's around them.
100%. 100%. And I think so many people miss that when they're scene breaking in a chapter. They forget that you still have to do those 5 things. Every scene still has to, and you know, in that case where we're bouncing around quickly, you're definitely going to break or bend these rules of the 5. Yeah. You still have to ground them and make sure they know whose head they're in and where they're at. But that can happen in a sentence as opposed to a paragraph or 2. Do we have to set up a conflict? No, we're coming back to the conflict that was already going on when we left. So the conflict is just kind of built in there. We're still rising through the conflict. Do we get an overcome? No, because we're gonna hit this scene 4 times, and the overcome is gonna be in that last one. Do you need a hook? Yes. Like you still have to end this scene with a moment of wait, don't go back to that. Wait, I want to. And then now you're in that other one, and then that ends in a hook, and you have to go back, and like that's what drives that reader through it. So the hook is still very important, and the setup is still very important. The other 3 in the middle, those get a little murkier when you're dealing with the same scene, or the same thing.
So just on a side note, in Magic Fall specifically, there will not be any problem in identifying the scene breaks, because it'll be 2 different narrators, because I'll be narrating Burry stuff and you'll be narrating Lyran stuff. So the voice will literally change with the scene.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about for the audiobook. Yeah.
Yeah, for the audiobook.
Yep. Yeah. So that's actually, and it's so the original books were done by a brilliant narrator named Cameron Byerly. He's done a bunch of David Edding books, whatever, but I didn't pick him. I didn't know him. The publisher did all that. Mm-hmm. Now that I have stepped away from the publishing industry and I'm doing everything on my own, this version is going to be an all cast audiobook. So all the characters are done by other people other than me. I'm not doing any of the characters, but I am doing all the narration. But what I have been practicing as I'm doing this final edit going through here is I have been practicing the narrative voice of the different characters. So I've got this kind of more graspy voice for the lion dude's narration as I'm reading his stuff. And then like for Elith, since she's kind of a machine, it's more of a I'm reading the narration like this, where it's just kind of this not really emotional, just kind of, so it's still my voice, but each of the 5 POV characters through that book, I am reading. I'm not just reading in my voice on all 5 of them. So I'm hoping that also helps. So like when you go from the kid in that scene that I just talked about there, when you go from the kid to the mercenary, kid to the mercenary, kid to the mercenary, I'm not doing a stereotypical whatever, but Clytus is technically Asian. There's no Asia in this world, but he's, technically Asian. And so I am reading it in a much different clip. They don't have Japanese, so there's no It's matter of fact, they're the most proper English speaking of the races. One race is like a pirate, and one race is like a Jamaican, and one race is like an Irish, and like they're the ones that are like straight up proper, no contractions, no slang type. But I am reading his in a kind of a clip, kind of a, I don't want to say, I don't know if I've ever tried to think about describing, but almost like a prissy little clip to it. And it's because that's just the way I hear it in my head. And so even that I'm trying to make sure that the audio book is going to feel, where Keimer Byerly, when he read it, like every other narrator, you just read it in the voice. And, he did the voices of the characters different, but his narrative voice was the same all the way through. And I'm trying to practice this before I get into the actual recording to make it different.
Okay, so let's do dialogue as the last part of this podcast. I think we've got like 10 minutes or so left.
Yeah.
So dialogue punctuation. Okay, let's start with actual tags. Like if you have a he said, she said, I said, exclaimed, whispered, anything that is an actual tag, you do not put a full stop, you put a comma. Okay? But it's the only one. So if the thing ends in an exclamation mark, it still ends in an exclamation mark. If it ends in a question mark, it still ends in a question mark. But if you would have a period, that period is replaced by a comma. And you have the speech tag. But this rule only holds for reals speech tag. So things that are about the words coming out the mouth, like said,
how it's being said,
asked, whispered, exclaimed, declaimed, all of those things that are about pontificated, like it's words coming out the mouth. Those words describe words coming out the mouth. It is not shrugs, nods, sighs. You don't sigh words.
Really
really. So none of those are speech tags. They are action tags. So you get a period, you get the action.
And the only thing you missed was, remember, all of this is inside. Well, the punctuation is inside the quotes. So it's open quote, dialogue, and then either a comma, exclamation point, question mark, close quote, and then the speech tag.
Yes.
Also, the speech tag is lowercase.
Yes.
Because it's all one sentence.
Yes.
Even if it's an exclamation point or a question mark, said Drake, the said would be, or, are you serious? Question mark, close quote, ask Drake. The ask would be lowercase.
Yes.
Because all of that is one sentence.
Exactly. So basically, if you're putting quotes in and you've got a speech tag, it's all one sentence and it's treated as one sentence. So you capitalize accordingly. Okay. If you are using dialogue tags, okay, and here's the thing, like in Magic Fall, we didn't use dialogue tags, but here I differ from Drake. I do not feel that you should avoid dialogue tags
Did we not use any? Did we not use any? I thought there was a... Really?
Yeah, I think I put in 3 and you wrote them out.
I mean, I'm one of only 2 published authors that I know of that don't use speech tags. And the other is the guy who wrote The Road, and he also doesn't use punctuation. So not only do you not know who's talking, you don't know when they're talking, because he is an absolute fool in how he wrote that book. I mean, just as cruel and mean to your readers as you can possibly be. But I do know that I do it right, because no reader nor reviewer has ever even mentioned that I don't use speech tags. So there is a method to that to make it flawless, and it is very difficult. It also, I wish I had planted my flag in that.
Yeah.
Because it does make it hard. It actually adds a level of difficulty to your writing that you just don't need.
So I agree. Like, okay, so here's my caveats. First off, I think that you should absolutely try and eliminate as many speech tags as possible. But the reason why I would say do not follow Drake down the path of no speech tags is because sometimes it is a smoother read to the reader to not have actions on every line. But
Yep.
if you are not using speech tags, you must have an action on each line, because otherwise, so no piece of dialogue can stand by itself, like completely by itself, unless it is abundantly clear who's saying.
Right. Right. You
And
can do it no more than about one a page or two. It
yeah,
has to be, the example I always use is, like spit flew from the drill instructor's mouth as he leaned into the private's face. Quote, "Do I make myself clear?" Exclamation point, close quote. New paragraph, quote, "Sir, yes, sir, period, close quote."
yeah,
Like, absolutely no confusion who said, "Sir, yes, sir," because it's the guy who's literally being screamed at an inch from his nose.
yeah.
But those don't happen very often. Like, you
And
don't get a lot of times where it's absolutely 100%,
yeah.
clear of who's saying this line.
And if you avoid speech tags at all costs, right, you can end up in a position where you've got actions cluttering your dialogue, okay, which might take away from some of the dialogue. So sometimes dialogue stands really well if it stands bare.
Right.
Sometimes.
So you're 100% right, which is where I say the difficulty comes in, because I'm not going to allow that to happen, which means now I've got to rewrite and rejigger and rechange and maybe not do the exact thing that I was thinking in my head, but do something else so that it doesn't have a negative impact. The example I always use is in the third book of the Genesis saga. The lion dude meets his kind for the first time, and in my head, when I plotted out this scene that I was going to write, it was him and this older lion dude, and they went out to the prairie, and there's nothing in the prairie. It's just very gentle hills and grass all the way to the horizon. No trees, the occasional one-off tree or whatever, but for the most part, that's it. And this is the moment that I was going to have the older kid wax all philosophical about their race and their religion and their culture, because he's never been around any of it. And so it's this great iconic scene in this plain with just a setting sun, and but it's a long dialogue piece. So for me, I have to have things. They have to do so. That's why a lot of my dialogue happens over meals. So I did end up adding a tree next to them, and he does reach down and pick up a blade of grass, and he does chew on it, and he does fiddle with it, and he does flick it. But then I added some rocks there so that they could interact with, and then they brought some food with them, and they sit around and now they're eating. And like, I had to add all this stuff. Now you read it and you don't notice this, you the reader, but it's not the iconic scene that I had originally. It still works great, but I had to work harder
So
and create a bunch of stuff that in my mind I wasn't going to put in that scene.
so I so here's the thing. So I actually have on Magic 4, where we had like a character interacting with the environment to indicate speech. I did actually have somebody say that it reads cluttered.
Mm.
Because there is an action and then there's dialogue, right? So it is something to be aware of, is that sometimes from the reader's perspective, they just want people to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And now you are filling the dialogue components with actions that aren't actually that important. They're there to identify the speaker.
Right.
So, and that's why I say, like, I don't necessarily say go all the way down this path of eliminating all speech tags. Sometimes you just want to say he said, because the piece of dialogue is the important part.
Yep. 100%.
Uh-huh.
And when did I come up with this planting my flag in the no speech tags? The same time that I came up with the I'm never going to use a scene break. But the no dialogue tags has stuck with me. I still actually like it. I think I do a good job with it. So, and no one has ever said that about, this Magic Falls is kind of an amalgamation of our two writing styles. So, I can definitely see somebody, seeing, noticing the no speech. That's why I didn't think that we did it. But if we did, we did. And I'll take the full brunt of the blame for that, because that's definitely my OCD insanity playing through. But with my writing, no one has ever said that. And I think it's because I pushed myself so hard. But it's now just my voice. Like, it isn't a mix of the two voices, which is always going to change.
Yeah. So I mean, I do try and kill a lot of speech tags. I do, because I do feel that it's important to write with as few as possible. But if I want a piece of dialogue to just stand as a piece of dialogue, and I just need to identify who said it, then I'll just say he said. And then I just also want to say he said, he asked. They are the overwhelming majority of my speech tags. I will use whispered on the very odd occasion, and then I will never write the word softly anywhere near it.
Right. Yeah, the death nail is ly adverbs within your speech tags. That's because they're all, not always, most of the time they're absolutely stupid. You know, he whispered quietly, he screamed loudly, he said anxiously. You are destroying the power of the moment by throwing that crappy ly adverb in there. You know, ly adverbs are thrown in because you are strengthening a weak verb. So
here's my rule. Here's my rule. If the speech tag required an ly adverb, it needs to be replaced with an action tag or an emotion tag. Yes. Because at that point, the dialogue is not strong enough to stand by itself.
Exactly.
If I can put Drake said onto that piece of dialogue, and that piece of dialogue can stand by itself in the scene without anything else, that's it. I put a speech tag and I move on, because the dialogue is the strength, and all the speech tag is doing is identifying who said it.
Amen. Like, I can't, if I could give you 500 million% support on that, like, that's it. That is literally the rule that everyone should be following on their speech tags. The speech tag has to do with the quality of the dialogue. If the dialogue is absolutely strong, you know, I've said this before on this podcast, there was that one author that I was reading with years and years and years ago, but they had this scene that was just terrifying. Basically, the POV is a female character. She's been captured by the bad guy and strapped to the bed, and the villain is gloating over her, and he's about to do all sorts of horrible things to her, and he says this line that absolutely is a terrifying piece of dialogue. I don't remember what it was. I just remember the words that came out of this character's mouth sent chills down my spine. And then it said, he said menacingly. It's like, yes, he did. Like, I don't need you to now tell me he did it, because literally when the words came out of his mouth, I was terrified of what he just said. And so it destroyed the power of that line. So if the line already does it, then, and you have to identify, you know, it's not something you just stand on its own. Because again, you can also, as I said, have lines that, if there's no doubt, and in that case, it's been 12, 15 years ago since I read this, I don't remember, but there's only these two characters in the scene, and one is a chick that's gagged and tied up to a bed, and the other one is the only one talking. So on those cases, you might actually have plenty of opportunities where you can just have a line of dialogue and nothing, no speech tag, no action tag, no nothing. So that may have been the case in that one. But even if not, then, you know, we need to identify, then it's the villain said, you know, whatever his name was or whatever it was. You definitely do not need menacingly. Now, to Marie's point, he says a line that is supposed to be menacing, but isn't actually menacing. The dialogue doesn't actually convey menace. That's when your knee-jerk reaction is to add that crappy ly adverb, because you're strengthening a weaker aspect. That's what you're doing. Anytime you're doing that, you need to stop and go, wait. Instead of strengthening a weaker aspect, can I rewrite the weaker part to just make it strong?
Or alternatively, the dialogue in itself might not be menacing. Like, I have a scene in the prologue of Ducal Heir, right, where the villain, all he says is on the table. Now, on the table is not a menacing piece of dialogue, but the villain walks around the steel table, his fingers trailing over the iron links of the chains, and says, on the table.
Right.
Like the actions make the dialogue menacing.
But that's still my point about rewriting.
100%.
So either rewriting the dialogue or rewriting the action around it.
Yes.
Because the ly adverb, if you said on the table, he said menacingly, then it's because the menacingly is there trying to strengthen the fact that the moment is weak. But like the way you wrote it, where he's got a glint in his eye and a excitement because whatever is going to be strapped to this table is obviously something that's getting his rocks off, and he's fondling these horrible torture devices with glee in his eyes. Then all of that is the strength, and the dialogue, because of its simplicity, actually now becomes terrifying because of the fact that
there's all these actions around.
It's in context with everything else.
So if you find yourself putting the ly adverb, then you need an action tag. If you're happy with just the speech tag, the dialogue is probably strong enough. That would be kind of my rule of thumb.
Well, that's what I wanted to. That's where I just want to make sure it's yes, it could need an action tag, or it could need other action around it to show it, or you might be able to rewrite the dialogue in a way that then conveys itself. Either one. It's, to me, that's a rewrite. If you put that ly adverb in, it means that you have used that ly adverb to try and strengthen weakness. So either look at the dialogue and see if you can put the menace, in this case, since we're talking about menacing, in the dialogue. If no, on the table is the dialogue and that's what you want, okay, great. Then the menacing needs to come from somewhere other than the word menacingly. And so now, like what you had with the toying with torture devices with glee, that is menacing. And so we don't need the word menacingly, because you're just strengthening weakness in the writing, either weakness in the dialogue, weakness in the surrounding emotions, surrounding actions, whatever. However it works out, if you hit those ly adverbs, they are always there, almost always there, to strengthen something that's weak. Or a lot, if they're not, then a lot of times they're redundant. Like screamed loudly. Well, there's screamed is screamed. You can't scream louder than scream, so they're just screaming. And if you do need something more, then you add more, like the scream ripped through the hall with a mournful pain that made my heart cry, whatever. Like, that's so much more immersive than she screamed loudly and I felt bad.
And I think that is a good place to end this podcast.
Yep.
Bye.
I guess I was supposed to say bye.